All right, aloha everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this joint housing post-session informational briefing. My name is Angie Chapman and I'll be moderating today's session. We're honored to be joined by the housing chairs of the Hawaii State Legislature, Senator Stanley Chang and Representative Luke Evslin, both chairs of the Senate Committee on Housing and the House Committee on Housing. This year's legislative session was a highly productive one for housing. Together, the legislature passed 23 housing-related bills, which we'll be reviewing and discussing today. These measures reflect a strong, coordinated effort across both chambers to address our state's urgent housing challenges with meaningful, forward-thinking solutions. We'll have about an hour and a half today for the presentations and to take questions. If you're joining us online, you can write your questions down in the Q&A feature on Zoom. For today's agenda, Senator Chang will start us off by reviewing housing bills related to public sector development and housing finance reform. Then Representative Evslin will share housing bills related to private sector development, helping low-income residents and renters, protecting local markets, Maui reconstructions, and other topics. The legislators will then review housing-related line items in the budget for neighbor islands, Oahu, and statewide funding, followed by a Q&A. And with that, I'll now hand it over to Senator Chang, who will walk us through key bills related to public sector development and housing finance reform.
All right. Good afternoon, and thank you everyone for being here. Thank you for the introduction and for hosting, Angie. Let's get right into it. So the first two bills that we have on our screen today, SB 739 and HB 800, both have to do with land exchanges. The first one is allowing land exchanges for the acquisition of lands for agriculture use in exchange for housing use. I believe that this is mainly directed at the neighbor islands. I'm not sure if there are any specific parcels they're looking at for that power. HB 800 does deal with several specific parcels here on Oahu. It would exchange several state parcels, including the Liliha Civic Center parcel owned by HHFDC and the Iwilei Fire Station, to the city and county. And in exchange, the city and county will be transferring Ali'i Place, the building in downtown Honolulu, the fee interest in that parcel to the state. So the city has already announced that they plan to redevelop the Liliha Civic Center area, so hopefully that'll facilitate that process. Next, we have the SB 79, which helps to streamline state development through the historic preservation process. For state and county housing projects, it requires DLNR to determine the effect of them on historic properties within 90 days and establishes a procedure based on the extent to which historic resources are known to be present at different levels of review for those different resources. So, historic review has been an issue here in housing development statewide for a long time, and this will help state and county developments through that process. SB 576, what its main purpose is to take the Public Housing Special Fund. So HPHA, the Public Housing Authority, has a special fund with some narrow uses. And this bill, SB 576, expressly allows that special fund to be used for housing development and redevelopment. And since they're embarking on a major development campaign, that will be very helpful to them. And we'll talk about some of the monies that they'll be getting later. Here we have three more bills. HB 1093 expands upon HPHA's previous statutory grant of power to build all housing projects. Before about 2022, HPHA had the power to build public housing projects that are federally regulated and defined, or pilot projects But they then received in 2022 the authority to build all housing projects, and HB 1093 makes conforming amendments throughout their statute to clarify that power is there. HB 1298 establishes a government employee housing program within HHFDC. The original concept was to use the Tier 2 rental housing revolving fund appropriation and use that to build housing to be rented to government employees. That changed over the course of the session. It's now coming out of the dwelling unit revolving fund, and it only contains an appropriation for rulemaking and for one position, but the concept would be to create one initial housing project that would be prioritized for rent to government employees, and that it could potentially be financed from the dwelling unit revolving fund, which will be getting an appropriation, as you will see later. Finally, SCR 60 and SR 45 urge HHFDC to develop a plan to produce sufficient housing to meet the state's demand, specifically at least 100,000 units. I think this is a really important plan because I don't think the state has, I think what the state needs to do is to identify specific parcels. This parcel and that parcel and this other parcel. These three parcels are where 6,000 units are going to go, and then these other parcels are where another 20,000 units are going to go, and so on and so on. And the state has not done that. They've produced reports. HCDA did a report at our behest about a year ago, and it didn't actually identify specific parcels and the amount of density that each parcel would have. I think that that's what this resolution is intended to do, and I hope that HHFDC will in fact do so. Okay, so HB 529 is highly technical. I don't fully understand it myself, but it's actually one of the most important bills this year. I think it was a year ago that the legislature, after several years of consideration, passed a bond volume cap recycling program. So basically, the federal government allows the state to issue a certain amount of money in tax-exempt bonds to, among other things, provide low-cost financing for housing production. When those bonds are repaid early, as they often are, the state did not have, but now has, the statutory authority to reuse that bond cap, those repaid bonds, to recycle them to issue yet another series of bonds. HHFDC proposed several possible uses that you see on the right-hand side. They could use these funds for financing on Tier 2 projects or gap financing for previously awarded Tier 1 projects, or who are repositioning as higher rent than Tier 1 projects being LIHTC projects, low-income housing tax credit projects, or even refinancing for senior debt. The bill actually has $300 million of authority in it, so $300 million is quite a lot of money, and there are a number of strings that come attached. I was under the impression that one of the major strings attached was that 20% of the units produced would have to be affordable to a 50% AMI level of affordability, which is quite low, but only affects a few of the units. I don't know if that's still true. It sounds like that may not be true under the Internal Revenue Code, but that one of the main obstacles will be that these bonds will have to be utilized within 6 months of their issuance, which is a very short amount of time. So I think it's all in the timing. So anyway, the bottom line is we potentially have opened up another $300 million, basically of free money, that can provide low-cost financing to housing projects. And in this high interest rate environment, I think that will make a big difference. Okay, so this next resolution, SR 60 and HCR 78, again, a fairly technical resolution. In 2024, the legislature allowed 201H projects to be eligible for these housing credits that could then be sold to fulfill housing, to the buyers of those housing credits could then use those housing credits to fulfill affordable housing requirements in their respective counties. That bill sunsetted within 5 years. So this bill sunsetted by 2031, I guess. And so this resolution attempts to declare the intent of the legislature that those credits can still be utilized if those credits were utilized were issued within that 5-year window. And then those credits could still be used after that 5-year window, after the act sunsets. All right, so the last one that I'm going to address here is HB 1409. This was the vehicle for the mixed income subaccount, which was had a number of vehicles throughout the session. There was SB 71, there was also HB 432, which was part of the House Majority Package, but HB 1409 ended up being the vehicle. And the bill is complex and has a number of parts, but I'm just going to focus on the first part, which is the mixed income subaccount, because I think that this is potentially the most consequential piece of housing legislation that we will have passed in all my years as the housing chair of the Hawaii State Senate. So basically, it takes the rental housing revolving fund, which is very large, and it creates within it a mixed income subaccount. Up until this point, the great majority of the funds in the rental housing revolving fund have been used for so-called Tier 1 funding. Tier 1 funding is prioritized for the low-income housing tax credit gap financing. And basically, low-income housing tax credit financing, the low-income housing tax credit is a federal program that pays for roughly 1/3 of the cost of developing a housing project that must be affordable at the 60% AMI level. The tenants, the rent that the tenants pay provide a further third of the cost of the project, and the remaining third roughly comes from a loan from the rental housing revolving fund. These rental housing revolving fund loans are very slow revolving. They revolve every 57 years because they're basically a subsidy disguised as a loan. They're not really a loan. And a lot of money has gone into this. Over $1 billion in the last decade. This year, you're going to see we added even more money to this rental housing revolving fund. There's now so much money in this fund that it is little old Hawaii, with only a 1.4 million population, now has a fund that is larger than the largest private sector affordable housing fund in the entire United States. This is also, as I've stated many times, the second largest recipient of state general fund surplus over the last decade, after only the rainy day fund. So if as a citizen of the state, if you're wondering where your tax dollars are going, this is the largest single destination for your tax funds. And I think we can all agree that after a decade of enormous investment in this fund for low-income families, the housing market has not dramatically improved. I don't think that the average resident of the state of Hawaii would say, yes, we have housing abundance where we used to have scarcity, and that people making only 60% of AMI are now finding an abundance of housing options. I don't think that that's what's happened. I don't think the average voter, in other words, has noticed the enormous amount of investment in this fund. So in order to try to make this fund create housing more efficiently, this subaccount would do a number of things. It would prioritize a diverse range of affordability up to 140% of AMI. It would prioritize state or county projects. It would overtly prioritize efficiency. It would prioritize TOD projects. And it would also prioritize any criteria that the HHFDC would then be able to establish. Now, this is a major step forward because it potentially can open up the rental housing revolving fund, much of which is unused right now. There's at least $150 something million in cash unused today in that fund that's uncommitted. However, there are a number of limitations. So on the left-hand side of this slide, you can see that, well, there was a 5-year sunset that was established. I'm not sure what 2023 refers to. I think it's 2028. So the bill goes away and the subaccount goes away in 2028 unless the legislature acts. Any funds that are repaid, loans that are made out of the subaccount, the repayments are actually going into the main rental housing revolving fund, not into the subaccount. And then the biggest of all is that there was no funding in this bill, nor was there the ability to transfer funds into the bill. So as of now, it's a subaccount without any funding in it. Any funding will have to come in future years. And these are major handicaps to the bill. It will not start working right away, at least. It does have the potential to start working if we are able to fund it next year. On the right-hand side, you can see a list of bullet points for what my asks were, not all of which were granted. The greens being the ones that did make it into the final bill, the reds being the ones that did not. So we were talking about housing. One potential workaround would have been to give the corporation the authority to transfer funds into the subaccount without legislative approval. That was not in the final version of the bill. What did go into the final version of the bill was that the funds can be used for loans, equity investment, credit enhancement, and any other type of financing, even though the 201H statute expressly contemplates that other types of financing, including equity, be made out of the rental housing revolving fund. The Attorney General's opinion was that only loans could be made out of the rental housing revolving fund. And one piece of feedback that we'd heard from developers was that inexpensive equity investment would actually be harder to come by than inexpensive loans. And so this is a potential major benefit of using the subaccount. I, as you know, have said many times that I'm strongly against income restrictions. I believe income restrictions are un-American. I believe that the Republicans are right when they call it class warfare. And I believe that housing, like public highways, public schools, public libraries, public parks, should be income blind. And that was not ultimately adopted because of the 140% AMI priority. I also wanted for sale housing to be allowed. That was not ultimately adopted. The bill is only authorizing rentals right now. I think one of the problems there is that for sale housing is often easier to finance, although today in a high interest rate environment, that may not be as true as it once was. The other 5 through 8 are important and did make it into the bill. It incentivized efficiency, which could be defined as the least amount of funding, state funds per unit per year. It also integrated perpetual affordability directly into Tier 1, a technical fix. It gave a preference. So the existing preference was for nonprofit projects over both government projects and for-profit projects. I believe that the government should at least be on equal footing with the nonprofit sector. And so we successfully have now priority for either government or nonprofit projects over for-profit projects. And finally, amendments to the rest of the 201H statute to conform to the above. So like I said, I think this is a potentially very exciting bill. I think that there is a lot of room for improving it and for tightening it up and for funding it in future years. But for now, it is a tantalizing city of hope on a hill that we will hopefully use as the main vehicle for financing new housing construction in the future. If you've attended these presentations in the past, you will know how passionate I am about this issue. And so I've created this visualization to try to explain why this is so important to me, why it is so important to me that we need a fast revolving source of funds for income blind revenue neutral housing. And what you can see is that, again, like I said, a typical rental housing revolving fund loan has a term of 57 years, which means that if we take the roughly $1.6 billion that exists in the rental housing revolving fund today, in a 57-year period, that $1.6 billion creates roughly 9,000 units. Now, that $1.6 billion was appropriated over many years. It didn't all just go in at once, so it's not like, it's not like in year 57 we get exactly 9,000 units. And the $177,000 per unit that's being used here is, again, it's a rough estimate based on recent rental housing revolving fund awards for LIHTC projects. And as you all know, LIHTC credits and bond cap, more importantly, are limited. So it's not like we could produce unlimited LIHTC housing even if we had the financing for it. But roughly speaking, 9,000 units over 57 years gives you an idea of the efficiency of the pace at which Tier 1 funding creates housing. And we have about 400,000 units of housing in the state of on the island of Oahu. So 9,000 units would not even make a drop in the bucket. It would be roughly 2% of the entire housing stock of the island of Oahu, and that would take place over 57 years. So every year you'd get roughly 1,500 or 600 units and change, which is actually a majority of all housing construction in Hawaii today, but not enough to move the needle, as probably all of us in this room can agree. If all of that $1.6 billion had been in a subaccount from year one, and all of that was deployed in year one, and all of that was redeployed every 3 years because these funds would be fast revolving because they're revenue neutral, that $1.6 billion could create 171,000 units of housing over a 57-year period, which is roughly 3,000 units of housing per year. which is a lot. That is probably about 3 times the amount of housing that the entire private sector builds in Hawaii today. So effectively, this would quadruple the amount of housing production in Hawaii today. And at 4,000 units a year, that would double the total amount of housing production in Hawaii today. And I think that would, I think if you doubled housing production, I think the needle would move and I think people would notice, especially if it were income blind, because at that point, people would start, everyone would start to know somebody who would be moving into one of these units, and the construction cranes would be visible in the landscape. So this is really critical. We can potentially unlock 162,000 units of housing just by reforming the way that we finance that housing. We are not all the way there yet. We're not even, very far down that road, but we have taken the first step down that road. And for that reason, this is a really landmark session, and this is a really landmark bill for housing production in the state of Hawaii. And I also want to just, I really believe that this is the last step. We've done a lot. We passed a lot of bills. I truly believe that this is the only step that we need to take to achieve housing abundance. It will take years after this point if we fully fund a fast revolving loan fund, but it will. Once it happens, I believe those other steps will fall into place over a period of years. And as Winston Churchill wrote on the day after the Pearl Harbor attack, so we had won the war after all, because he knew on December 8th, 1941, even though there were 4 years of hard fighting ahead, that with America on its side, the United Kingdom would prevail. And that's how I feel about fully funding this fund. It is the last step that we need to take. I also want to emphasize this. I think there's a perception out there that we would be underfunding the critically important 60% AMI rentals that are needed that LIHTC produces. So this is, I'm actually told that there was a more recent version of this study that came out just today. But until today, this 2019 study by the Hawaii Housing Finance and Development Corporation was the most recent demand projections for housing demand in Hawaii. And as you can see, it breaks out demand by income category from less than 30% AMI to over 180% AMI. It breaks it down by whether the demand for sale versus the demand for rent, and then for single family versus multifamily. And I have had a lot of problems with the methodology of this study in the past, and I still don't think that the methodology is very rigorous. But I want you to be very clear about what we're building with low-income housing tax credit. We are building only what's in that one highlighted box. That's it. 1,789 units. And actually, primarily what we're building is the multifamily. I'm not sure if there's any LIHTC single family out there. There might be a little bit, but primarily it's multifamily. So really, it's actually the 1,319 units a year. This is over a 5-year period, 2020 to 2025. So on average, we need about 300 something units and change of 60% AMI rentals in the state of Hawaii. We have put so much money into the Rental Housing Revolving Fund Tier 1 that we are producing at least 3 times this amount of housing for 60% AMI. And that one highlighted cell is the only cell that is being overbuilt now in the state of Hawaii. That cell is being overbuilt 3 times right now, and every single other cell, including the very high range ones, are being underbuilt. So we have a very imbalanced housing supply pipeline right now. That one box, again, to reiterate, is over half of all the housing supply in Hawaii. All the other cells combined are less than half the housing construction in Hawaii today. All right, with that, let me hand it off to Representative Evslin, and I will stop my screen share.
Thank you, Senator Chang. Thank you, Angie, for helping set this up and moderate for us, and certainly thank you to Senator Chang for motivating me to do this every year. If it were the week after a session, I prefer to just sit and stare at a wall or something all week, to recover. But here we are. Let me figure out how to share my screen. All right. Does that work?
Yes.
And play. All right. First off, when Senator Chang says he is passionate about rental housing revolving fund, that's an understatement. He is incredibly passionate, and we've spent a lot of time this session in passionate conversation around the rental housing revolving fund and a lot of the bills on here, which he, I want to give him credit for his incredible dedication to housing financing, and I think we worked really well and collaboratively throughout this session. And certainly didn't, get all of what we were hoping for, but I think we did, have a number of really important wins this session. So I'm going to go over 13 bills, and just for starters, I should say that I, for my first time, used an AI PowerPoint maker. So if you're wondering where that is in Hawaii, it's nowhere because it was made up by AI. It was actually pretty amazing. I put the content into this thing, and then within like 10 minutes, it generated this PowerPoint presentation. Some of the pictures were weirdly inappropriate, which I took out. AI is not always that good, but anyway, most of them are interesting. For me, a lot of the focus was on removing state bottlenecks to try and identify and remove as much bottlenecks as we could at a state level. We got in a little bit of trouble last year for preempting the counties and gently encouraging them to allow more ADUs. So this year we tried to stay away from preemption, and we're looking at things that we could do, removing bottlenecks from the state side. So a lot of bills to remove state bottlenecks, a lot of work to fund workforce housing, as Senator Chang has talked about, and then there was also some tenant protection bills. So I will run through them. HB 1409, Senator Chang gave a really good overview of the mixed income subaccount. I'm going to touch on some of the other parts of the bill. And just for starters, on those elements of the mixed income subaccount that were not included, I will say I think for both of us, we want to try and get a lot of that, included next year, including hopefully maybe removing that sunset or extending it more, certainly getting it funded, and letting the fund revolve into itself, I think are things that both Senator Chang and I really strongly agree with each other on. So along with establishing that mixed income subaccount, though, the bill, part of the reason that I think it was the most important bill this session was for establishing the definition of transit supportive density. So what it does is it defines, currently right now, state is putting a bunch of money into TOD, but we've never defined TOD, and we don't define any standards for, density standards for within the TOD areas. So the bill defines transit supportive, it defines TOD, and then separately it defines transit supportive density, and it essentially sets differing floor area ratio standards for close proximity to rail, and then in the greater TOD outside of that, and then for neighbor island TODs. So it establishes these floor area ratio standards, which for the most part is higher density than is allowed currently around the rail stations on Oahu, and certainly higher density than is allowed on the neighbor islands in their TOD areas. And then it says that the counties, to be considered transit supportive density, must process permits ministerially based on these floor area ratio standards. So the idea is to allow higher density, and instead of going through a discretionary permit process, which goes through Honolulu City Council for approval and comes with a whole bunch of, they can essentially pull like community benefits out of the thin air and impose it on these projects, that you would have a codified set of, here are the requirements, which are codified in code, which are objective and standard for every development, and then the permits would be processed through the planning department level. So it establishes this definition. It just doesn't force the counties to do it, though. It just says in order to be considered transit supportive density, you have to comply with this, and then it prioritizes use of the fund for TODs that comply with this definition. In the long run, the idea is to, my hope would be that we can tie more and more funding sources to this definition of transit supportive density, right? To create a big enough carrot for the counties to essentially come on board and make it as easy as possible to develop high density housing in and around rail. So that's what I'm excited about the bill is that transit supportive density part. It also directs HCDA to at least look at transit supportive density when they're looking at their infrastructure within HCDA areas. HB 420, another kind of oddly borderline appropriate picture. These entirely, again, AI generated. But so HB 420 was the construction defect reform bill. To be honest, was not aware of what a big deal construction defect litigation was until essentially last summer. UHERO came out with an amazing report January, February, showing around 1 in 3 new homes are subject of construction defect litigation. Essentially, right now the standards are very, very low, so you can initiate a suit without even identifying specific defects. You get a lot of mainland attorneys who are coming here and just sort of priming the pump on these projects, suing them. Insurance companies are going to be quick to settle because they don't want these things to get drawn out. And so it's an easy way for attorneys to make a bunch of money. Homeowners often, because 30 to 40% of the settlements are going to attorneys, the homeowners aren't getting much out of it. So HB 420 would just says that you have to identify a specific defect to go forward with the lawsuit, and the contractor has to be given an opportunity to inspect and ability to offer repair. Right, the homeowner can take that repair, or they can proceed with a lawsuit. Whereas right now, they're often not even given the opportunity to at least offer repair. So I think that this is really consumer protection. Get the homeowner, get this thing repaired for the homeowner, and create more sort of consistency to make sure that these are actual defects that these homes are being sued over. And sorry, so 1 in 3 homes are being sued. This significantly increases insurance prices. It increases financing costs for these units. If homes are the subjects of litigation, people can't even get financing at all. And it's also slowing down construction as people are, rightfully worried about building new fee simple homes. So I think this could be, a significant reform. HB 732, updating SMA minor. So currently, the threshold for an SMA minor is $500,000. It doesn't move with inflation. This bill just says essentially moves it to 750, which is what it would have tracked, for inflation the last time it was shifted. But it caps properties along the shore that are actually a shoreline parcel or subject to wash of the high waves at 500,000 with no inflation. Right, so it actually sets up two different standards. Within the broader SMA, 750 tracking with inflation. Along the shore, it'll be 500. This was a Lahaina-centric bill initially, right? They're looking to rebuild a lot of parcels, are having issues not qualifying as an SMA minor, which requires extensive public hearings, et cetera. And then by setting it at 500 along the shore, that was, in my opinion, a compromise, and actually rightfully so. I think there's a lot of issues with coastal development, and we want higher levels of scrutiny for those parcels. HB 735 is, so currently a single septic system can serve up to 5 bedrooms or 2 dwelling units and no more than that. Department of Health has been considering pretty broad in their interpretation of what a dwelling unit is. So if you have a house and you're doing exterior bedroom units, each of those exterior bedroom units is often going to be considered its own dwelling unit. Certainly if you're trying to do multiple ADUs, 2 ADUs off of a main house, each of those ADUs is its own dwelling unit, which you couldn't put on a single septic. So just for example, you can have a kitchen and a 1 bedroom, and then to try and do 2 exterior bedrooms off of that wouldn't be allowed on a single septic. So this bill would delete the prohibition on no more than 2 dwelling units. So up to 5 bedrooms, regardless of the number of dwelling units on a septic system. This will, for a place like Kauai, where we've got half of the homes are on cesspool and people are looking to convert, this will be, a pretty instant game changer for people, allowing them to add on ADUs or guest houses. As I'm looking at my AI PowerPoint, well, and this was actually a good slide. It made up a septic system outside of a house, but the text is probably too small, so I should give our AI overloads that feedback. This amazing AI picture, which is obviously easily identifiable someplace in downtown with our monorail. SB 1263 is does a number of things. One, it clarifies that essentially county agencies can issue initial effect determinations on historic impacts. It gives SHPD a specific time period to concur or not concur with that initial determination. It doesn't say it on here, but a big issue right now is if there's multiple phases of a development, the interpretation is that people got to come in for multiple SHPD clearances on those multi-phase developments. This just clarifies essentially that if the scope of the development doesn't change based on the initial permit, you don't need repeated SHPD clearance for multi-phase development. And then most importantly is that it gives an opportunity to essentially pre-clear parcels within TODs. So the counties have a time period laid out in the bill. I think it's 6 months or a year, to identify sort of high opportunity development parcels, and to send those to SHPD. SHPD will, look based on everything that they know about these areas and previous findings in the areas, et cetera, and then essentially sort of like give pre-clearance for those parcels with, that will likely have no impacts or limited impacts. So the idea is to sort of create consistency for parcels in already developed areas where we know there's been no findings in the past. SB 66. I see some architects here who are probably interested in SB 66. This bill initially started as just a 60-day shot clock, right? So the early versions of the bill essentially said that the counties have to approve a permit within 60 days. From conversations with the counties, that seemed like that would be pretty problematic in that they would just end up rejecting the permit on day like 59, right? What they're saying is that most often when these things are dragging out longer than 60 days, it's because, they're sending this thing back with comments. The comments aren't getting resolved in time. So they would just said, either they would want a mechanism to stop the clock in that case. And if the counties have the full ability to stop a clock, then a 60-day shot clock doesn't do anything because they're just going to stop it, at every opportunity. Or if they're held to 60 days, then they'll just reject on day 59, right? So the straight up shot clock, we couldn't figure out a good way to make it work. This was kind of a compromise, which maybe made nobody all that happy, which I'm hoping means we were successful if it actually works. But so it creates a 60-day period still. Once it goes beyond 60 days, an architect can self-certify their plans. Essentially, the architect would indemnify the state and the county. Architect has to have $2 million reliability insurance. They're taking responsibility of this project. They are certifying that this thing is in full compliance. And then ultimately, the certificate of occupancy will get a sort of a notation that this was a self-certified building. Importantly, the county still has the full authority to come in and issue, say, zoning violations after the fact, right? So if an architect, say, just designs a monster home, right? They put it in for a permit, and then the county gives them back comments. They wait the clock out. They go past 60 days. This architect self-certifies this monster home and builds the monster home. On day one of that monster home being built, the county can come in and issue a notice of zoning violation and start fining this person, daily fine, and even require that they knock this house down, right? Same thing as currently exists. In that case, the expectation is that the homeowner would sue their architect for self-certifying these plans, which were clear zoning violation. And in which case, the architect would likely lose their, if they get sued, then they're not going to be able to hold on to liability insurance. And this architect in the future would no longer be able to actually go through the self-certification process because they're not going to have $2 million in liability coverage. So I think the safeguards are there. Also, doesn't apply along the shoreline. Buildings must be less than 30 feet tall, et cetera, et cetera. HB 830 creates a third-party review process at SHPD. If SHPD can't complete a review within 60 days, then the applicant can request third-party review for their project. SB 38. So currently, 21H-38 projects, right? They essentially go through 2 layers of discretionary review. HHFTC will review these projects. Then they transmit a resolution to the Honolulu City Council. And then the council can make their own determination. And the HHFTC might recommend certain AMIs and certain levels of fee waivers, et cetera. And then the county can sort of throw all that out the door and make their own requirements for the project to proceed. What this bill essentially just says is that the councils cannot impose stricter conditions, AMI caps, or reduced fee waivers less than what HGFTC has already approved. Counties can still reject the project entirely, right? They have that authority. They just couldn't impose these conditions, which would make the project more expensive. In the bill, in conference, we added language that requires HHFTC provide an opportunity for the counties to comment on the projects, which they already, by practice, do. So the intention here is that the counties will come forward identifying, issues that they might have, conditions that they want to impose on the project. Maybe there's a roadway improvement or whatever. HHFTC, wants these projects to be able to pass the muster of the county, so they will take all this into account. Hopefully, then they come up with, a project that is going to pass muster at the county level, and then they move it on to the county. The intention here is just sort of to reduce the amount of sort of duplicative review and the ability for the counties to significantly increase costs and reduce consistency for these projects. The next few I'm going to run through real fast. SB 572 just prioritizes the Affordable Housing Revolving Fund for CDFIs. SB 1413 gives HPHA broader authority to essentially take and dispose of abandoned property. SB 65, credit Senator Chang was a champion for this, will infuse $10 million over each of the next 2 years into HPHA to renovate units. As he has said, this is a very efficient way to get vacant units online. And then SB 332 will prohibit the bundling of properties in foreclosure auctions. Also somewhat Lahaina-centric here in that it's, as I understand, possible and happens somewhat regularly that parcels get bundled at auction, which makes it really hard for an individual, say, tenant who's living on one of these properties or, say, descendants of the family to be able to purchase these properties at auction because they're auctioning, 5 of them together. So this prohibits the bundling of properties. And then importantly, it gives essentially a first right of refusal to tenants, state or county, or community land trusts to match the winning bid within a certain time period after the auction occurs so that they could, acquire these properties. Oops, this was a typo. Oops, sorry. This should be HCR 66. Again, I blame AI for that typo. But this just, so currently building code requires 2 sets of stairwells to access building. And as far as I understand, this adds a lot of costs to developing, mid-rise buildings. It also creates sort of this relatively boring apartment design that we have where you have, there's double loaded corridors and a hallway in between them. So all American apartment buildings look the same. Whereas if you go to many other countries where they have single stairwells, you can get much more creative uses of floor plans, interior courtyards, layouts. I think it also enables sort of, more bedroom types in these buildings. And there's plenty of data showing that single stairwell buildings are not any more dangerous with modern construction methods. So this just directs the State Building Code Council to allow single stairwell throughout Hawaii. Currently, Oahu actually does allow single stairwell. And then here are the capital improvement projects that were the Neighbor Island CIP that was in the budget. $93 million for Maui Veterans Home, $2.5 million for Kalaupapa, and $15 million for Kauai Community College. And then Senator Chang, did you mention the Rental Housing Revolving Fund, that $200 million Tier 1 and Tier 2?
That's coming later.
Okay. And that is all I've got.
So Representative Evslin already covered the Neighbor Island funding in the budget. I'm going to go quickly through the Oahu and statewide funding. The Aloha Homes project, the first tower is going to be at the corner of Ward and Kapiolani, as you may already know. The site of that Jack in the Box and the building with the Obama mural behind it. And HCDA already has a vendor, a developer that's working on it. They came into this session initially asking for $30 million, and appraisal showed that their units would be able to sell for significantly more than they initially thought. So they only needed $15 million to complete the project. Basically, the $15 million is going to go to owning the garage. So the state HCDA will own the garage afterwards as an income-producing asset in exchange for its investment into the project. But this project is underway, and with this funding and the continued funding for the personnel needed to carry out this project, I anticipate this will be the first 99-year leasehold revenue-neutral project in the state of Hawaii, and it will hopefully be a big success and spawn the construction of many more. OHA had been trying to develop its Kaka'ako Makai parcels. There was a bill earlier this year to do so. However, there were a lot of unanswered questions when it comes to the the stability of the site, the soil conditions, and so on. So $1 million was appropriated for planning and for community outreach for the development of those parcels. In addition, there was $12 million for infrastructure for the Evile Kapalama area, which the city has already identified as a major area for new growth. HPHA has been working on its 10,000 unit Kalei Momi development. They got a lot of funding this year, I think $68 million in total, of which the largest chunk went to Mayor Wright Homes for first phase, which would be 308 units. This would be gap financing for LIHTC housing, again 60% AMI housing owned by the state, by the Public Housing Authority. Additionally, they also got planning and design funding for 2 additional projects, the Ka'ahumanu Homes redevelopment in Kalihi and the Nanakuli Homes redevelopment in Nanakuli. This is also significant because initially the thought was that the governor asked for, I think it was $75 million into the Rental Housing Revolving Fund Tier 1, and the thought was that all of that money would get sucked up by HPHA for its Kalei Momi development. To my surprise, I learned that HHFTC has the authority to award RHRF applications without regard to its own QAP, which is a federally mandated process, and without regard to all of the criteria that are heavily negotiated and heavily planned out in that process. And because there was some consensus among the higher ups that all that money should go to HPHA, that would mean that the private sector wouldn't get any of the appropriated funds this year, but HPHA is getting its own allocation. So the $50 million that's going to Tier 1 is going to continue to be available to any public or private developer proposing a LIHTC project. There were another couple of really significant additional funding streams into housing. So at 586 South Street, there's a vacant state-owned parcel, and they got about $35 million to build a kupuna supportive housing project to house homeless kupuna in the Kaka'ako area. In addition, University of Hawaii has had several vacant dorms for many years that have fallen into such disrepair that they're no longer meeting health and safety requirements for occupation. And the legislature appropriated almost $120 million for renovating these vacant dorms to house UH Manoa students. Now, I remember touring some of these towers. I don't think that these were the particular towers that were affected, but needless to say, this is a significant amount of new housing for UH students that should significantly ease the burden on the surrounding communities of the UH campus. There was a lot of statewide funding in addition. The TOD Council got $2 million, as it often does. We were talking about the Rental Housing Revolving Fund Tier 1. They got $50 million for each of both the next 2 years. This is on top of the $153 million in cash that they have sitting around that's uncommitted. So at least last year, they could have awarded $153 million more in projects, but they didn't feel that the projects were ready. And so I don't know why the state keeps throwing cash into Tier 1 when there aren't enough projects to absorb that amount of money. But here we go. That's $100 million that went into that fund. And into Tier 2, another $100 million divided over 2 years. We were hoping that that would go into the mixed income subaccount, and I still hope it does next year. Tier 2 is available for higher funding, for higher AMI restrictions than Tier 1 anyway, so it would be effectuating the purpose of Tier 2 in any case. The Dwelling Unit Revolving Fund got another $40 million infusion. Kauhale, which are these pop-up type projects for homeless individuals, got a significant $30-something million over the next 2 years, and further $11.3 million went into homeless services. DHHL got an additional $20 million for repair and maintenance. They increased their special fund ceiling, and they also got several new positions. And that's it. So we've taken 53 minutes of your time already. I think we have another 40 or 30-something minutes left. So
yeah, great. Thank you, Senator Chang, and thank you, Representative Evslin. I thoroughly enjoyed the AI photos in your presentation. So we'll now open it up to questions from the audience in person and over Zoom. If you are in person and you have a question, if you can come up to the mic so that everyone on Zoom can hear you. And if you're on Zoom, you can type your question in the Q&A feature. So if anyone here has a question, you're welcome to come up. Checking the chat. Okay, so we have some questions coming in over Zoom. Our first question is, can you expand more on what that means if the mixed income subaccount is not funded? Does that mean it's not usable until there is funding in it? How much would need to be put into the fund to make a significant impact on Hawaii's housing landscape?
So there is no funding in the fund, and therefore it cannot be used until funding goes into it. And so there is no current mechanism to put money into it. Hopefully we will come back next year in the legislature and correct that problem and put some funding into it. How much would make a significant impact? That's a more subjective question. I think $500 million would be a great start. I know that's a lot of money, but again, there's $153 million sitting around in rental housing revolving fund that's not being used. Another $100 million is going into that fund over 2 years. Any other committee chair in the building would be clawing and scratching for $10 million. And yet we have this odd problem here in housing where we get tens of millions of dollars going to funds where they're not even being used. So I can't fully explain it. I think if we started with $500 million, that would start to make an impact. I think $1 billion would get to the point where the whole state would notice the difference and where we would really move the needle on the housing market.
Just add briefly to that. So the budget does include $15 million over each of the next 2 years for Tier 2 housing, which would be workforce housing, above 60 and less than 140% AMI. The difference with the sub-account is that the sub-account set more clear parameters on the use of that funding, and really importantly, the sub-account wouldn't lapse. So HGFTC could have the time to set the fund up, ensure that this is going to good projects, and really to ensure that the development community is sort of moving in that direction, that they know that the continuity of this sub-account, that the sub-account is always there. Right? When we have a sort of a one-time infusion into Tier 2, then I don't think we have those parameters, and it's going to fund a bunch of workforce housing, which is great, but it's not going to do what I think Senator Chang has been, fighting so hard for it to do.
Great, thank you. Someone else asked if the recording will be available. This will be posted on Senator Chang's YouTube channel by the end of next week. Next question on Zoom asks, thoughts about HB 1406, the Speed Permitting Task Force? Question mark. Not sure if we completely understand your question. Brian, if you want to elaborate on that question, you can type that out. Unless.
Yeah, sorry. This went through Economic Development Committee and not through the Housing Committee. So to be honest, I'm not super familiar with what it does. I know the intention is to speed up government processes. I don't know if it's been elaborated further than that.
Gotcha.
It did
Okay.
pass, yeah.
And it's a task force.
Yes, it passed. Yes, task force.
And then a follow-up to that, how effective could SB 1406 be? I don't know. I meant HB?
Depends on the recommendations of the task force. I don't know. I do think it's good to try and, again, I read the description of the bill just now, so I don't know that much about it, but and we've talked about it briefly in caucus. Clearly, it's important to identify what bottlenecks are in state permitting processes and try and remove those. So again, it depends on what the recommendations are and if we can actually codify those recommendations.
Great, thank you. Our next question over Zoom, will you be able to address any additional housing priorities or anticipate any budget changes related to housing in this special session?
That's a good question. So there's been a lot of talk about having a special session for mainly funding purposes this fall. If the Trump administration goes ahead and makes a lot of the cuts to state funding sources that it's pledging to make. There's a lot of uncertainty, however, so we don't really know what's going to happen, or if a special session will be needed at all. I do know that the Senate if there's a special session called, that the Senate is required to take up appointments, not just to judicial vacancies, but also to administration vacancies, or that would be an opportunity for the Senate to do so, or else they will continue to serve in their positions without Senate approval until the next regular legislative session. So I think that appointments will have to be considered by the Senate. I don't know if, I think it's a leadership call if other bills will be, heard or considered in a special session that aren't directly related to these federal cuts.
Great. Go ahead. Got a question in person? Come on up. Thank you.
I read Mizoe, AIA Hawaii. Question on, what is it here? HB 732, the SMA minor bill. So thank you guys for considering all of our comments related to that. We wanted to kind of pick your brain about, so thanks for increasing the dollar amount that homeowners can go to the SMA minor. That was a good move on your part. We're looking at, we kind of got it in at the last minute, but I guess it didn't get all the way through. But our comments were, if SMA is set up to protect the shoreline, protect the environment along the shoreline, and that's one of Hawaii's most precious areas, then we were pushing for a square footage, actually a building footprint area limit, where that would limit and help homeowners still rebuild without a dollar amount cap, but stay within all of the zoning requirements for an SMA minor and still rebuild without going to SMA major. The 750, even though it's better than the 500K original bill, does get homeowners who want to do small addition or a small renovation, but it doesn't get the homeowner along within the SMA an opportunity to rebuild their entire home. So we would be still advocating, if this comes about next session, to change that to a building footprint maximum. And I think that would be a better way to go, because it protects the land and the ocean much better than a dollar amount. You can still ruin the entire shoreline with $750,000. So, and that's the reason for SMA minor, SMA major setups, and the review processes for both.
Yeah, I can respond to that briefly. So this bill actually didn't come to the housing committees either. The only reason I was vested is because I introduced it and helped sort of shepherd it through. And Chair Hashem in Water and Land in the House did add the square footage language, which I think you're right to argue for an objective square footage figure in there. And as Chair Hashem says, it's like the golden toilet, right? If somebody buys $1 million golden toilet, this would require an SMA major, even though there's, no impact to the shoreline if you're installing a toilet into your house. Yet you could do something bigger, which would still be an SMA minor. So I think you're right on the square footage thing. That language ultimately wasn't included in the bill because if it were included, the bill wouldn't have passed out of conference. Or actually passed out of the Senate even. So I think it does require some work over the interim to figure this out. I know that Chair Hashem is pretty vested in, really looking comprehensively at our SMA rules and laws and trying to figure this out, because there's a number of inconsistencies in there currently. So more work for the future.
Thanks.
Yeah.
The last thing that's related to all the housing projects ongoing is, can you guys elaborate on where the governor is at on reinstating the State Building Code Council? Or is there a push to get the governor to reinstate the State Building Code Council? And that's something that is dear to our hearts related to building code. We're advocates for building code all the time in life safety for general public.
So I know from the early days of session or just before session that we were hearing that that was going to be a push and that there was a push to get, the funding for an executive director in the budget. To be honest, I haven't verified whether that's in there or not, or what the current status is.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Appreciate it.
All right, thank you. Okay, we have one more question in Zoom chat. How will you protect local families from getting kicked out? As far as we can see across the media and news articles, families are facing homelessness. Kalihi and the stadium in Halava are facing these crises.
I'm not sure if they're talking about specifically the Kuhio low-rise redevelopment that HPHA is undergoing, but for that project, the residents are governed by federal tenant relocation provisions, which are considered the gold standard of tenant protections in this country. Now, that being said, there are a lot of problems that have been well documented in the media. People, being offered housing that's already been rented out to another family, or being offered phone numbers to landlords who aren't landlords. We've been working closely with HPHA on those complaints and on those issues, and those families will get rehoused. They will, because the federal government requires them to be. So it has not been a smooth process, and but I would say that these are the relatively lucky ones. I think as a community as a whole, we have to come to grips with the fact that in America, tenants don't have protections. Tenants can be evicted at the end of their lease for no reason. And that's the reality of what we have here in Hawaii. And I would very much be open to visiting that question in the future. And I think that's one of the reasons why home ownership is so attractive here in Hawaii.
If I can just add a little bit, I mean, right, there was HB 1325 was the relocation assistance bill, which didn't pass. And I do think it's something that we should continue to explore and try and figure out something. I do think if we're providing state assistance for development, we should ensure that there's a soft landing for people within these projects. I also want to, HB 740 and HB 739, not relocation assistance bills, but they were two bills that also died, which I know Senator Chang, we've talked about trying to work on through the interim, and that they would have created a deed restriction program to ensure that units that received financing through these programs would have to be perpetually occupied by a local resident working in Hawaii. So somebody could still certainly get displaced at the end of their lease term, but at least you're ensuring that there's a local resident coming into these units. And I think the mechanics of the bill, I think, we agree on some parts about it, but we got to figure out a pathway forward to ensure that we can make this happen. So there's still certainly work to be done on the front of the question.
Great. And this next question actually relates to the prior question, and I think you both kind of touched on it already, but I'll read the question out loud. So the first public housing redevelopment in the Kalemomi plan at KPT Kuhio Homes has been a disaster leading to displacement, homelessness, and housing insecurity. Can you explain why HB 1325 was killed when it clearly demonstrated negative impacts on the community? What protections for right to return, community-oriented workforce development, and preferences for access to newly built units are in place for housing insecure neighbors?
So we did address this a little bit earlier. So the residents at KPT are public housing residents. They are very, very much protected. They have the best protections out of anyone in the state. And that's not to say that they've had an easy relocation process. It has been difficult. And we are, as we speak, working with HPHA to try to iron out those problems. And it may take time, it may take further resources, but I'm confident that that will happen. So HB 1325 would not have affected those tenants. It would not have affected those tenants who are governed by a federal regulation. For 201H-38 projects that the bill did address, HHFDC already imposes relocation requirements on awarded projects. So enshrining them in statute might not be a bad thing, but it does not change pre-existing practices that exist today. So I think we should definitely have an opportunity to talk about it in future years. But this was not the year for that bill.
And then just one more follow-up note on that, and then we can move to someone else's question. But the person on Zoom said the developers have told the community that federal protections for right to return do not apply in this case. Do you have any knowledge on that? Okay. All right. Open it up to any in-person questions. Sigru, and then we'll come to you after.
Hello, I'm Betty Lou Larson with Catholic Charities Hawaii. And in the study you cited, for those at 30%, there were about 5,000 individuals needing housing. And I believe it was yesterday, UH came out with a study about people who are surveyed and interested or thinking about moving to the mainland. 40% of Hawaii's residents, and unfortunately 56% of the Native Hawaiians who were in that study were thinking about moving. And the 66%, the percentage of the reason was the high cost of living, and that includes housing. Housing is usually the driver for a lot of that. So how would the new system be able to be able to address that need for very low income, very affordable housing? Right now, they're living in the 60% AMI units because that's all that's available. HHFDC had a study that said something for seniors, something like 67% of the units are occupied by seniors who have less than 30% AMI, even though there's only, I don't remember, 200 or something set aside units, a very small number, because 5% of those units have to be set aside for that particular, but the people actually there are higher. So how could you address that? Because there is definitely a lack of units for even 40% AMI. I mean, it's not only 30, that very low. And how would the new system really be able to address that great need?
Thanks, Betty Lou. It's great to see you. I think that if we take a step back, I want to, there are places in the world with successful, well-functioning housing systems without a lot of homelessness, with very little to no homelessness, in fact. So I think we need to proceed on an inductive basis. We should see what works instead of sort of just sort of having gut reactions to things. So the Rental Housing Revolving Fund Tier 1 program has funded an enormous amount of low-income housing by any standard. We may be building more, Tier 1, 60% AMI housing than any other state per capita. And like I said, it is triple the demand that is forecast according to HHFDC's own studies. So much so that, as you pointed out, as much as a third of these units are actually being occupied by people who are making even less than 60% AMI. Whether they're on housing vouchers or some other way, they are somehow paying for these rents because they have to pay the 60% AMI rent, even if they're making 30% of AMI. What a healthy housing system like Vienna or Singapore looks like, it is that it has three major components. It is non-rationed, so everyone wants it, gets it. It is income blind, so anybody, regardless of income, can live there. And it is revenue neutral, so this government can build as much as it wants without relying on the fickle legislature or parliament to appropriate funds on a year-to-year basis. And so what you see is that, for example, in Singapore, where they are selling their units for hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe we might think of in the 100 to 140% AMI range, they actually will rent out individual units in those buildings to low-income families at a very low price. But that is still much cheaper than the Section 8 voucher program that we have in the United States. So let me be clear about the Section 8 voucher, and if you've been to these hearings before, these meetings before, you've heard me say this. The Section 8 voucher program is a Gerald Ford Republican program that is designed to defund government housing and put that money straight into the pockets of private landlords. Okay? The private landlords don't even have the decency to comply with non-discrimination provisions, and as many as 50% of those voucher holders are unable to find a private landlord that's willing to rent to them. And so even if they've been on that list for 10 years or 20 years in California, 10 years here in Hawaii, they are no better off after having gotten to the front of the list than they were before. So the Section 8 system is not these are not great systems. What we need is a critical mass, a large supply of government housing. Government can police itself to be non-discriminatory in a way that the private sector, we've tried and failed to prohibit them from discriminating. And government can also offer much lower rents than the private sector can. Section 8 rents are actually higher than market in most instances. And so a Section 8 landlord is actually collecting more rent from a Section 8 voucher holder and is getting a guaranteed check from Uncle Sam, as opposed to, you know, a market private tenant. So I think we should stop lavishly funding all of these, you know, wealth transfers to the rich. And I think we should actually take responsibility as a government to creating the housing that we need in our society and to deploying it at low costs for these people. So, you know, one of the shocking things that I learned about socialist Vienna, which had a socialist majority government, openly socialist red Vienna government since 1920, is that they spend less on Section 8, their equivalents of Section 8, than per capita than we do here in Hawaii. And that is a testament to the efficiency of public sector taking direct responsibility rather than private sector, you know, leaving things to the vagaries of the private sector.
If I could just add one small thing. So, you know, the sub-account bill, there was multiple iterations in multiple different vessels throughout session. And I just want to clarify that the final version that passed didn't change the 5% set aside for tier 1 projects through our HRF, right? So that at least, you know, in my opinion, that we should be maintaining the current RHRF funding source for tier 1 projects for LIHTC. And then the sub-account would be on top of that separate. So we would still get the 5% set aside for 30% AMI projects.
But we all have the same goal, to house our people.
If Betty Lou, if you haven't noticed a difference after over $1 billion in state appropriations, if it is just as bad today as it was before the $1 billion, I think the system needs change.
All right, come on up.
Thank you. My first time in one of these meetings, so pretty exciting. My kind of questions are kind of similar to hers in a sense, in terms of the revolving fund. Senator, I know you mentioned that there's no AMI restrictions, it's income blind. Are there any other restrictions on it or major restrictions on the revolving fund in terms of how it can be used?
The sub-account?
Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe I can pull that slide up.
And while he's doing it, just to clarify, the sub-account actually does, it's prioritized for 140% AMI and below. And that the market for those projects is likely going to be 80 to 100% projects, right? There's very little development appetite for building 120%, 140% AMI restricted projects, because that's basically market rate, and you're not going to find somebody willing to jump through all the hoops to live in, you know, 120%, 140% restricted unit. So very likely with the structure that's in the sub-account, those would be 80% to 100% units that would be incentivized to be developed. Sorry, but as...
Yeah, so as you can see, there are a number of restrictions. One of them is that all of the residents have to be qualified residents as defined by 201H-32, which means they have to be, you know, an occupant, a real bona fide occupant, and a person who owns a majority interest in no other real property. They have to be 18 years old. There are a variety of other restrictions. Let's see. If we go to the next slide, you can see that even though the bill got significantly watered down, I think a mature bill would allow both for sale and for rent. I think it would really prioritize that fiscal efficiency. It would, and it would be prioritized for government projects, which don't discriminate. So I think a fully mature sub-account would be providing short-term financing that's very cheap to large-scale housing development. And because it's short-term, and it would be used for both equity financing as well as loans, the money could be redeployed every few years. So I think it would be, you know, every single one of these units in a government project would be for a local person for the lifetime of the project. I mean, government has no incentive to try to lift those restrictions. Government has no incentive to maximize its profits. So I think that these are structural reasons why we can put these kinds of restrictions on a government project that the private sector would really not feel comfortable with.
Okay. So it's my understanding from the revolvingness of the funds that will allow significantly more housing to be built is that the funds will be loaned out to a developer who will build the house and then sell it, and then within that 3-year time frame, they would go back into the revolving fund. Am I correct?
Yeah, so for a for sale project, once the building is completed, then the developer collects the sales proceeds from all the buyers and then repays the loans, equity investments, and other financing. For a rent project, there's something called stabilization. If the rental income is sufficient to basically pay for the construction costs, the initial financing, the construction loan and equity investments can also be paid off within a short 3 to 5 year window. And then a private sector lender would step in, and then it would be repaid through the rents that are being collected from the tenants.
Okay, because my understanding here is basically a lot more people rent than buy just because of the cost burden in terms of buying housing here. So it seems like it would be more suited to build rent affordable units rather than units that will be for sale. Is that my understanding?
Well, first of all, the majority of residents in the state are homeowners. But you know, there are lots of renters in the state of Hawaii, more than most states. The question is how we can, the scale. We could build free units and give them away for free. That would probably cost, you know, $500,000, $600,000 a unit. And the person paying for that, everyone's paying for that. The major source of general fund state revenue in Hawaii is the general excise tax, which is charged, which as our friends across, you know, the nonprofit sector have remind us constantly, is a regressive tax. When a homeless person walks into a convenience store and buys a cup of coffee, they are paying the general excise tax. They would be paying for a free unit that they might never get the chance to occupy. So we have to be efficient with our tax dollars. We can't just keep sticking the bill to taxpayers. The state is not Santa Claus. The state has to be able to create a financially sustainable pipeline of housing. And that's what the object of the sum account is.
Okay. This might be my opinion, but it just seems like even though it's being efficient in terms of its housing, it's still incentivizing more higher level income streams to buy housing, where you have to have a 6-figure income as an individual to be able to actually afford the housing under that program, just because the construction and the land costs alone would not incentivize renting or selling them to someone that makes 50 to 80% AMI in the area. Am I incorrect in that?
I mean, then if you want to stick the tab to that homeless person buying the cup of coffee, I mean, that's who's going to pay for it.
Okay. My other question, it does kind of have to do with housing, so just tell me if I'm incorrect in this, but for me, I'm on my local neighborhood board in Ala Moana, Kaka'ako, and there are several empty lots in there in very pristine areas across from the convention center, across from Ala Moana, and across from the Walmart that have been vacant for almost a decade now. And from what my understanding is, they've been vacant either because funding has dried up or the developer has gotten into legal trouble, so they haven't been able to build. Is there anything in the housing bills here that would help either have the state finance the housing or the state buy up the land, or to have something be able to be built on the land that would be beneficial for the neighborhood and for residents?
Sorry, and they're entirely vacant right now, or there's existing structures?
They're entirely vacant. The previous structures were demolished.
I mean, nothing off the top of my head beyond the infusion of money into RHRF, right? That we're providing financing for hopefully a private developer to come and maximize use of these projects.
Okay.
But I do, just kind of back to what you were saying earlier, I want to be doubly clear that, again, the priority for under 140% AMI is currently in the sub-account. And so while the sub-account could be used to fund a project that also has market rate units in it, right, in order to score high enough to get the funding, there would have to be a mixture of lower AMI units in there, which almost certainly would end up being 80 and 100% AMI units. And I do share some of your concerns that if we were to remove the AMI preference entirely while prioritizing efficiency, I do think we could see higher AMI the fund getting used for higher AMI parcels, which could be a very efficient use of state money, but maybe wouldn't be targeting lower AMI households that we'd want to be targeting.
Yeah, that's kind of my thoughts exactly on that, but yeah, that's all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'll go to a question in the chat. How might other legislative action addressing property insurance help support housing development?
So I mentioned HB 420, the Contractor Repair Act bill, again, which will, I think, hopefully, over the next few years have an impact on the insurance markets as the cost of holding insurance for the likelihood of defect litigation is high. My guess is that the question was more referring to the property insurance stabilization bill that passed, which my guess is wouldn't have much of an impact on new construction, in that the issue isn't necessarily, these buildings that aren't able to find insurance in the traditional markets are not newly constructed buildings. They're older buildings that have had claims or don't have retrofits necessary to hold on to insurance, and they're stuck getting insurance in the surplus markets, which is where the insurance stabilization bill is going to help. So off the top of my head, my guess is not a huge impact on new construction. But Senator Chang, if you have other thoughts.
All right. This next question is probably targeted towards Senator Chang. So they said the average HDB apartment in Singapore is $612,000. That's still not affordable, and wouldn't it be more costly in Hawaii with more regulations and barriers to build?
I think they're probably referring to the average resale HDB apartment, or the existing cost of all HDB, or the price of the average HDB apartment of any HDB apartment chosen at random, of the median HDB apartment, whether or not it's for sale. I think that, which is far higher than the price that most people pay. Most people buy so-called BTO HDBs, built-to-order HDBs, which are brand new, and the average cost of those is like in the $200,000 range. So everyone is able to buy a really low-cost apartment, and we know that because Singapore has a home ownership rate of 90%, which is really high. So most people can afford home ownership. Then, once they buy the unit, then it appreciates in value. And some people have the resources to be able to buy a resale unit that has appreciated in value over time, because over time, the new development that used to be out in the boonies somewhere is now surrounded by shopping and, lots of amenities, and so it becomes more valuable. So that's why they appreciate in value. Now, every Singaporean still has the option to buy a new unit. If they cannot afford an existing resale unit, they can still buy a brand new one for much, much cheaper. And so I think, that would be the model here in Hawaii too. I think in America, one thing I've noticed is there are a lot of people who believe that you cannot both have abundant, affordable housing for all and a rising housing market. And that is simply not true. That's just completely untrue. And Singapore demonstrates that. You can have an unlimited supply of cheap new housing as long as the government keeps building, and every unit can appreciate in value. And that's what the Singapore experience really demonstrates to me.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to give a quick shout out to, because we mentioned other bills that have died, 739, 740, HB 1325, and since we've got some DHHL folks in the room, want to mention HB 606, which did not pass, which would have provided significant funding to DHHL, and I do think it's something we need to do next session, is ensure that there is, significant funding, and maybe in the long term a dedicated funding source to DHHL. And then also want to mention HB 1410, which would have created a dedicated funding for infrastructure, which also didn't pass, which is also, I think, really important. So just looking into next session, sort of those are some of my goals. But sorry, Perry, you had a question?
Yes, and I'll be quick. Aloha, everyone. Perry at Housing Hawaii's Future. Actually, HB 606 was in my head because I know it died at the last minute. I just wanted to ask what your thoughts were on DHHL's priorities and how they fared this session, and maybe you could talk about why they fared the way they did. Thank you.
So ultimately, we didn't get release on any funding through HB 606. So that's why the bill ended up dying. I honestly can't say because I don't know why. And I do know in the long run it's a priority of the speakers to fund DHHL appropriately. I do think that DHHL, when we're building, when DHHL is building housing, we know that that is going to Native Hawaiians, and it's probably the most important housing that we can be building in Hawaii, and it's going to Native Hawaiians forever. So I think it is a really good use of housing money in the state, and I know the speaker agrees. So I'm hopeful that in the future we can get, something passed with significant funding. That's all. Sorry. I wish I had a better answer.
All right. We'll just have one more comment in the chat, and then we'll wrap it up. In response to some of the earlier questions, someone wrote, "We sincerely thank Chair Chang and Chair Evslin for their leadership and continued support of affordable housing in our community. Just to clarify that no tenant in good standing has become homeless as a result of the redevelopment. Every affected household was offered two options, a Section 8 voucher or a transfer to another public housing unit with all relocation costs fully covered by the agency. Each resident also received a written guarantee of their right to return after redevelopment and will continue to pay no more than 30% of their income toward rent once built. HBHA has worked closely with the developer to address all concerns raised. The majority of households have already relocated or are in the process of doing so. Only a couple units have declined to move entirely, and we are addressing those cases in full compliance with the applicable laws." All right, thank you for your comments. And that is all for today. Thank you everyone for joining us and for staying engaged in this important conversation on housing. We know your time is valuable, and we appreciate your commitment to staying informed on the legislative efforts underway to address Hawaii's housing crisis. If you're interested, this info briefing has been recorded and will be posted on Senator Chang's YouTube page by the end of next week. Thank you, everyone, and take care.
Thank you all.